The ongoing crisis between the United States and Iran has reached a critical point where military pressure, economic warfare, and nuclear ambitions are colliding in a dangerous geopolitical standoff. The first major issue to understand is the U.S. blockade strategy, which was launched after peace talks failed in Islamabad, marking a dramatic escalation aimed at cutting off Iran's economic lifelines and restricting maritime trade through the vital Strait of Hormuz. This move has not only intensified tensions, but also disrupted global oil supply routes, creating ripple effects across international markets. The second key point is the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but crucial passage through which a significant portion of the world's energy supply flows. Ongoing military actions, threats, and ship interceptions in this region have pushed the global economy into uncertainty and heightened fears of a broader regional war. Third, the crisis is deeply rooted in the nuclear standoff, where Iran continues to advance its uranium enrichment capabilities despite military strikes and international pressure, with experts warning that its timeline to potentially develop a nuclear weapon remains dangerously close. The fourth major issue is the failure of diplomacy and peace talks, as negotiations between the two sides have repeatedly collapsed, with both nations refusing to compromise on core demands such as sanctions relief, nuclear restrictions, and control over strategic waterways, leading to a prolonged deadlock and increasing mistrust. Finally, the fifth point is the risk of full-scale war and global consequences, as military threats, retaliatory actions, and aggressive rhetoric from both sides continue to escalate, raising concerns that even a small miscalculation could trigger a large-scale conflict affecting not only the Middle East but the entire world. In conclusion, the U.S.-Iran tensions today are not just a regional dispute but a complex confrontation involving military power, economic pressure, and nuclear strategy, making it one of the most dangerous global crises of our time. The current escalation in tensions between the United States and Iran cannot be understood without examining the strategic logic and implications behind the American decision to impose a naval blockade, a move that represents one of the most aggressive forms of non-declared warfare in modern geopolitics. Unlike conventional military strikes, which aim to destroy infrastructure or military capability directly, a blockade operates by slowly suffocating a nation's economy, restricting its ability to trade, export resources, and maintain internal stability. In the case of Iran, this strategy is particularly significant because of the country's heavy reliance on maritime trade routes for its oil exports, which form the backbone of its national economy. By targeting these routes, the United States is not merely applying pressure, it is attempting to reshape Iran's strategic behavior without immediately triggering a full-scale war. At the heart of this blockade strategy lies a calculated effort to exploit Iran's economic vulnerabilities. Oil exports account for a substantial portion of Iran's government revenue, and any disruption to this flow directly impacts its ability to fund domestic programs, maintain political stability, and support regional allies. By positioning naval forces in and around critical shipping lanes, the United States effectively creates a choke point, forcing commercial vessels to either avoid Iranian ports or risk interception, inspection, or even seizure. This form of economic warfare is designed to isolate Iran from global markets, reduce its financial resources, and increase internal pressure on its leadership to reconsider its policies, particularly regarding its nuclear program and regional activities. However, the blockade is not just an economic tool, it is also a powerful psychological instrument. Presence of U.S. naval forces in strategic waters sends a clear signal not only to Iran but to the international community that Washington is willing to escalate the situation significantly to achieve its objectives. This show of force is intended to deter Iran from taking aggressive actions while simultaneously reassuring U.S. allies in the region, such as Gulf states, that their security concerns are being addressed. At the same time, it creates a sense of urgency and uncertainty as the line between economic pressure and military confrontation becomes increasingly blurred. One of the most complex aspects of the blockade strategy is its legal and diplomatic ambiguity. Under international law, a blockade is traditionally considered an act of war, particularly if it restricts access to a nation's ports and territorial waters. This raises critical questions about the legitimacy of the U.S. actions and whether they could justify a military response from Iran under the principle of self-defense. The United States, however, may frame the blockade as part of a broader effort to enforce sanctions or maintain maritime security, thereby attempting to operate within a gray area of international law. This ambiguity is not accidental. It allows Washington to apply maximum pressure while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability and avoiding the formal declaration of war. From Iran's perspective, the blockade represents an existential threat that cannot be ignored. Iranian leaders have consistently emphasized their right to defend their sovereignty and economic interests, and any attempt to restrict their access to international waters is likely to be met with resistance. This could take various forms, ranging from diplomatic protests and legal challenges to more aggressive actions such as harassment of naval vessels, deployment of anti-ship missiles, or even attempts to disrupt shipping in the region. Such responses would not only escalate tensions but also increase the risk of direct military confrontation, particularly if miscalculations or misunderstandings occur in the highly volatile environment of the Persian Gulf. Another critical dimension of the blockade strategy is its impact on global trade and energy markets. The waters surrounding Iran are among the most important transit routes for oil shipments in the world, and any disruption to this flow can have immediate and far-reaching consequences. As shipping companies face increased risks and insurance costs, they may choose to reroute their vessels or reduce operations leading to supply shortages and rising prices. This, in turn, affects economies around the globe, particularly those that rely heavily on imported energy. In this sense, the U.S. blockade is not just a bilateral issue between Washington and Tehran. It is a global concern that has the potential to destabilize markets and strain international liquidity. The effectiveness of the blockade as a strategy depends on several factors, including the level of international support it receives. If key global players align with the United States and enforce similar restrictions, the pressure on Iran could become overwhelming. However, if other nations choose to bypass the blockade or continue trading with Iran through alternative routes, its impact may be significantly reduced. Countries like China and Russia, for example, have historically maintained economic ties with Iran and may view the blockade as an overreach of American power. Their response will play a crucial role in determining whether the strategy succeeds or fails. It is also important to consider the historical context of blockades as a tool of warfare. Throughout history, blockades have been used to weaken adversaries without engaging in direct combat, from naval sieges in ancient times to the submarine warfare of the 20th century. While they can be effective in the long term, they often come with significant humanitarian consequences. As restrictions on trade can lead to shortages of essential goods, including food and medical supplies. In the case of Iran, a prolonged blockade could exacerbate existing economic challenges and place additional strain on the civilian population, raising ethical concerns about the human cost of such strategies. Ultimately, the U.S. blockade strategy represents a high-stakes gamble. On one hand, it offers a way to exert significant pressure on Iran without immediately resorting to full-scale war. On the other hand, it carries substantial risks, including the potential for unintended escalation, legal challenges, and global economic disruption. As tensions continue to rise, the success or failure of this approach will depend not only on military, but also on diplomatic maneuvering, international cooperation, and the ability of both sides to navigate an increasingly volatile situation. The world now watches closely, aware that this strategy could either force a return to negotiations or push the region closer to a conflict with far-reaching consequences. The escalating tensions between the United States and Iran cannot be fully understood without recognizing the immense strategic value of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that has become the kentron of global energy security and geopolitical competition. This vital passage, located between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and ultimately to the open oceans, making it one of the most important maritime corridors in the world. Despite its relatively narrow width, at some points only about 33 kilometers across, it carries a disproportionately large share of the supply, with roughly one-fifth of globally traded oil passing through its waters. This singular fact transforms the Strait of Hormuz from a simple geographic feature into a powerful strategic lever, capable of influencing global markets, decisions, and military strategies. At the core of the current crisis is the reality that whoever controls or disrupts the Strait of Hormuz hold significant influence over global energy flows. For the United States, maintaining freedom of navigation in this waterway is a top priority, as it ensures the stable flow of oil supplies to global markets and protects the economic interests of its allies. For Iran, however, the strait represents both a lifeline and a strategic bargaining chip. Iranian leaders have repeatedly signaled that if their ability to export oil is restricted, particularly through measures like blockades or sanctions, they may respond by threatening or even attempting to close the strait. This dynamic creates a dangerous balance of power, where each side possesses the means to inflict serious damage, yet must carefully weigh the consequences of doing so. The military dimension of the Strait of Hormuz is equally significant. The presence of naval forces, particularly those of the United States Navy, has increased dramatically as tensions have escalated. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and surveillance vessels patrol the region, aiming to deter aggression and ensure the Kawipsi's passage of commercial shipping. At the same time, Iran has developed a range of asymmetric capabilities designed specifically for this environment. These include fast attack boats, naval mines, anti-ship missiles, and drones, all of which can be deployed quickly and unpredictably in the confined waters of the strait. Unlike traditional naval warfare, which often involves large-scale engagements between fleets, conflict in the Strait of Hormuz would likely be fragmented, and highly unpredictable, with small-scale incidents carrying the potential to escalate into broader confrontations. One of the most concerning aspects of the current situation is the increased likelihood of miscalculation. The narrowness of the strait means that military and commercial vessels often operate in close proximity, leaving little room for error. A single misunderstanding, such as a misinterpreted maneuver, a warning shot, or a technicheski malfunction, could quickly spiral into a larger incident. History has shown that such are not merely hypothetical. Past encounters between U.S. and Iranian forces in the region have at times brought the two countries dangerously close to open conflict. In the current of heightened tensions, the margin for error is even smaller, and the consequences of any incident could be far more severe. Beyond its military and importance, the Strait of Hormuz also plays a critical role in shaping global energy markets. Any disruption, whether real or perceived, can lead to immediate fluctuations in oil prices, as traders react to the possibility of supply shortages. Even rumors of instability in the strait can trigger spikes in prices, affecting industries and consumers worldwide. For countries that rely heavily on imported energy, particularly in Asia and Europe, the stability of this waterway is not just a regional concern, but a matter of national economic security. This interconnectedness underscores the global stakes of the U.S.-Iran standoff, as decisions made in this narrow corridor can reverberate across continents. Another layer of complexity arises from the involvement of regional and global powers. Countries in the Middle East, especially those bordering the Persian Gulf, have a direct stake in the MYT of the strait. Nations such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates depend heavily on its open passage for their own oil exports, making them particularly vulnerable to any disruption. At the same time, global powers like China and European nations have significant economic interests tied to the stable flow of energy supplies flowing through the strait. This creates a Sluzhnaya web of interests, where multiple actors may seek to influence or respond to developments in the region, further complicating efforts to manage the crisis. Diplomatically, the Strait of Hormuz has become a focal point for negotiations and международного pressure. Efforts to de-escalate tensions often revolve around assurances of maritime security and commitments to keep the waterway open. However, these discussions are frequently undermined by broader disagreements between the United States and Iran, particularly regarding sanctions, nuclear activities, and regional influence. As a result, the strait remains both a NQT tension and a potential avenue for compromise, depending on how the situation evolves. From a strategic perspective, the importance of the Strait of Hormuz lies not only in its current role, but also in its potential as an escalation. In a worst-case scenario, a deliberate attempt to block or close the strait, whether through mining operations, military strikes, or coordinated dive, could trigger a chain reaction of responses, drawing in regional and global powers and potentially leading to a wider conflict. Even short of a full closure, intermittent disruptions could have lasting effects on global trade and economic stability. Ultimately, the Strait of Hormuz stands as a stark reminder of how geography can shape geopolitics. Its narrow waters carry not only LNFT, but also the weight of competing interests, historical grievances, and strategic calculations. In the context of the U.S.-Iran crisis, it represents both a flashpoint and a pressure point, a place where the of nations converge and where the KHT between peace and conflict remains dangerously thin. As tensions continue to rise, the world's attention remains fixed on this critical choke point, aware that its fate may well determine the trajectory of one of the most consequential geopolitical confrontations of our time. At the heart of the escalating confrontation between the United States and Iran lies one of the most complex and dangerous issues in modern geopolitics, the nuclear standoff. While naval deployments, economic blockades, and regional tensions dominate headlines, it is Iran's nuclear ambitions and the international response to them that ultimately define the stakes of this crisis. The dispute is not simply about weapons, it is about power, deterrence, sovereignty, and the balance of influence in the Middle East. As both sides dig deeper into their positions, the nuclear issue has evolved into NQT of no compromise, where each KHW forward by one side is perceived as a direct threat by the other. To understand the current standoff, it is essential to examine the origins of Iran's nuclear program. Officially, Iran has long maintained that its nuclear activities are intended for peaceful purposes, such as energy production and scientific research. Under the framework of the International Atomic Energy Agency, countries are allowed to develop nuclear technology for civilian use, provided they comply with inspection and transparency requirements. However, concerns have persisted for decades among Western nations that Iran's program could be diverted toward military objectives, particularly the development of nuclear weapons. These concerns are rooted in both technical factors such as uranium enrichment levels and strategic considerations, including Iran's regional ambitions and adversarial relationship with the United States. The turning point in this came with the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement between Iran and major world powers designed to limit Tehran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Under this deal, Iran agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, limit its enrichment levels, and allow enhanced inspections of its nuclear facilities. For a time, the agreement was seen as a breakthrough, offering a diplomatic-chesky solution to a problem that had long threatened to escalate into military conflict. Second, the withdrawal of the United States from the agreement in 2018 marked a significant shift, leading to the reimposition of sanctions and a gradual erosion of the deal's provisions. In the years since, Iran has incrementally expanded its nuclear activities, increasing enrichment levels and reducing cooperation with international inspectors. While Tehran insists that these steps are reversible and intended as leverage in negotiations, critics argue that they bring the country closer to what is often referred to as breakout capability, the point at which it could produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in a relatively short time. This perception has intensified concerns in Washington and among its allies, fueling calls for stronger measures to prevent Iran from crossing this threshold. From the perspective of the United States, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons is a core national security objective. American policymakers argue that a nuclear-armed Iran would fundamentally alter the strategic balance in the Middle East, potentially triggering a regional arms race and increasing the risk of nuclear proliferation. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and others in the region might feel compelled to pursue their own nuclear capabilities in response, leading to a more unstable and unpredictable security environment. Moreover, there are fears that nuclear weapons could embolden Iran to take more aggressive actions through its network of regional allies and proxies, knowing that it possesses a powerful deterrent against direct retaliation. To counter these risks, the United States has employed a combination of strategies, including economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and, more recently, military posturing. Sanctions have targeted key sectors of Iran's economy, particularly its oil exports and financial system, with the aim of forcing Tehran back to the negotiating table. At the same time, the U.S. has strengthened its military presence in the region, signaling its readiness to respond to any perceived escalation. This approach reflects a broader strategy of maximum pressure, designed to constrain Iran's options and compel it to accept stricter limitations on its nuclear program. However, from Iran's perspective, the situation looks very different. Iranian leaders view their nuclear program as a sovereign right and a symbol of technological advancement and national pride. They argue that the country has complied with international agreements in the past, only to face continued pressure and sanctions, which they see as unjust and politically motivated. The experience of the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA has reinforced skepticism in Tehran about the reliability of diplomatic agreements with Washington. As a result, Iran has become increasingly reluctant to make concessions without strong guarantees that its economic and security interests will be protected. Another Vajni aspect of the nuclear standoff is the role of deterrence. Even without possessing nuclear weapons, Iran's advancing capabilities create a form of strategic ambiguity that can influence the behavior of its adversaries. This ambiguity can act as a deterrent, discouraging potential attacks by raising the stakes of any confrontation. At the same time, it increases uncertainty, as other countries may feel compelled to act preemptively if they believe Iran is approaching a critical threshold. This delicate balance between deterrence and provocation is one of the defining features of the current crisis. The risk of military escalation remains a postoyanaya concern. While both sides have so far avoided direct conflict on a large scale, the possibility of targeted strikes against nuclear facilities is frequently obsujdaitsia. Such actions would carry significant risks, including the potential for retaliation, regional destabilization, and long-term environmental consequences. Iran's nuclear infrastructure is dispersed and, in some cases, deeply fortified, making it difficult to eliminate through conventional means. This reality further complicates the strategic calculus, as any attempt to neutralize the program could require sustained military operations with uncertain outcomes. Diplomacy, meanwhile, remains both essential and elusive. Efforts to revive negotiations have been hindered by deep mistrust, conflicting demands, and shifting political dynamics on both sides. The United States seeks stricter limits and broader SURE-WT, while Iran insists on sanction relief and respect for its sovereignty. This deadlock has created a situation in which neither side is willing to stoop it, yet both are aware of the risks of continued escalation. The absence of a clear diplomatic pathway increases the likelihood that the crisis will be shaped by events on the ground rather than deliberate agreements. Ultimately, the nuclear standoff between the United States and Iran is more than a technical dispute over enrichment levels and inspection protocols. It is a reflection of deeper geopolitical tensions, historical grievances, and competing visions for the future of the Middle East. As the situation continues to evolve, the stakes remain extraordinarily high. A diplomatic chess-key breakthrough could pave the way for stability and cooperation, while a breakdown could push the region and potentially the world toward a conflict with unprecedented consequences. In this fragile and uncertain environment, every decision carries weight, and every moment of hesitation or miscalculation brings the world closer to a NQTHE, where the balance may tip irreversibly. One of the most defining features of the current U.S.-Iran crisis is not just the rise in military tension or economic pressure, but the steady collapse of diplomacy, the very mechanism that once prevented this rivalry from turning into open conflict. Over the years, negotiations between Washington and Tehran have moved from cautious optimism to deep mistrust and now to near-total deadlock. The failure of diplomacy is not a single DTTN, but a gradual process shaped by broken agreements, conflicting expectations, and shifting geopolitical priorities. Today, the absence of meaningful dialogue has created a dangerous vacuum, where military strategies and economic coercion are replacing negotiation as the primary tools of engagement. The roots of this diplomatic breakdown can be traced back to the unraveling of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which once stood as a symbol of successful multilateral negotiation. The agreement had created a framework where Iran limited its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief, offering a rare moment of cooperation between long-standing adversaries. However, the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA fundamentally altered this dynamic. For Iran, this move reinforced a long-held belief that the United States could not be trusted to honor its commitments, while for Washington, it reflected dissatisfaction with the deal's scope and enforcement mechanisms. This divergence in perspectives marked the beginning of a new phase of mistrust that continues to shape interactions today. In the years following the collapse of the agreement, multiple attempts were made to revive negotiations, often mediated by international actors and organizations such as the United Nations and the European Union. These efforts, however, were repeatedly undermined by deep KHTLFT over key issues. The United States has pushed for broader terms that would address not only Iran's nuclear program but also its missile development and regional influence. Iran, on the other hand, has insisted on a more focused approach, demanding the removal of sanctions and guarantees that any new agreement would not be abandoned in the future. This fundamental mismatch in priorities has made it extremely difficult to find common ground. Another major factor contributing to the failure of diplomacy is the role of domestic politics in both countries. In the United States, policy toward Iran has often shifted with changes in leadership, creating uncertainty about long-term commitments. Different administrations have adopted varying approaches, ranging from engagement to maximum pressure, making it difficult for Iran to assess the reliability of any agreement. Similarly, within Iran, political factions hold differing views on how would the United States. Hardline elements tend to view negotiations as a sign of weakness, while more moderate voices advocate for diplomatic engagement as a means of reducing economic and pressure. These internal divisions further complicate the FWD process, as leaders on both sides must balance international considerations with domestic expectations. The erosion of trust has been perhaps the most damaging consequence of these developments. Diplomacy relies not only on formal agreements but also on a degree of confidence that both sides will act in good faith. In the case of U.S.-Iran relations, this confidence has been severely weakened. Each side now interprets the actions of the other through a lens of suspicion, often assuming the worst intentions. For example, Iran's to expand its nuclear program are seen by the United States as evidence of aggressive intent, while Tehran views U.S. sanctions and military deployments as proof of hostility. This cycle of mutual distrust creates a self-reinforcing pattern where even small gestures of cooperation are overshadowed by larger concerns. The failure of diplomacy has also shifted the balance toward more coercive forms of engagement. With negotiations stalled, both sides have increasingly relied on strategies such as economic sanctions, military signaling, and indirect confrontation through regional allies. While these approaches may provide short-term leverage, they do little to address the underlying issues driving the conflict. In fact, they often exacerbate tensions, making it even harder to LOWD to the negotiating table. The current blockade strategy, for instance, can be seen as both a symptom and a cause of diplomatic failure, an indication that traditional LHWR has broken down and a factor that further reduces the likelihood of renewed talks. International actors have attempted to bridge this gap, but their influence has been limited. While organizations like the United Nations and the European Union continue to advocate for dialogue, their ability to enforce agreements or guarantee compliance is constrained. Meanwhile, other global powers have their own strategic interests, which may not always align with efforts to de-escalate tensions. This fragmented international response has made it more difficult to create a unified front capable of DGT both sides toward compromise. Another critical issue is the absence of a clear framework for future negotiations. The original nuclear deal provided a structured approach with specific timelines, verification mechanisms, and DRWT. Today, no such comprehensive framework exists, leaving negotiations without a clear direction. Even when talks do occur, they are often limited in scope and lack the momentum needed to produce meaningful results. This lack of structure contributes to a sense of stagnation, where discussions continue without leading to concrete outcomes. The consequences of this diplomatic deadlock are far-reaching. Without effective communication channels, the risk of miscalculation increases significantly. In a crisis environment where military forces are in close proximity and tensions are high, even minor incidents can escalate rapidly if there are no mechanisms in place to manage them. Diplomacy serves not only to resolve conflicts, but also to prevent them from spiraling out of control. Its absence, therefore, creates a more volatile and unpredictable situation. Despite these challenges, the possibility of renewed diplomacy cannot be entirely dismissed. History has shown that even the most entrenched conflicts can eventually find paths to negotiation, particularly when the costs of confrontation become too high. However, for this to happen, both sides would need to demonstrate a willingness to compromise and to rebuild a minimum level of trust. This would likely require incremental steps, such as confidence-building measures, limited agreements, or indirect communication channels, rather than a single comprehensive deal. Ultimately, the failure of diplomacy between the United States and Iran is both a cause and a consequence of the current crisis. It reflects deeper issues of mistrust, conflicting interests, and political complexity that cannot be resolved bishabalala. Yet, it also highlights the importance of dialogue as a tool for managing conflict in an increasingly interconnected world. As tensions continue to rise, the absence of diplomacy remains one of the most dangerous aspects of the situation, leaving the future uncertain and the path forward unclear. Whether through renewed negotiations or continued confrontation, the choices made in the coming months will play a decisive role in shaping the trajectory of this ZMAE and its impact on regional and global stability. As tensions between the United States and Iran continue to escalate, the most alarming dimension of this crisis is the growing risk of a full-scale war, one that could extend far beyond the borders of the two and reshape the geopolitical and economic landscape of the entire world. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is not just the Samsidro capabilities of the Urkau sides, but the complex network of alliances, Team-Tesican dependencies, and regional rivalries that could quickly transform a bilateral conflict into a lane, Bas-Makiao confrontation. In such an environment, even a small spark, a miscalculation, a localized clash, or an unintended escalation, could ignite a chain reaction with consequences that are difficult to predict and even harder to contain. At the center of this lies the high of military readiness and presence in the region. The United States Navy, along with allied forces, maintains a strong derka in and around the Persian Gulf, equipped with advanced systems capable of projecting power across land, sea, and air. Iran, meanwhile, has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, including missile systems, drones, and naval tactics designed to exploit the narrow geography of Region waterways. Unlike conventional wars, where front lines are clearly defined, a conflict between these two actors would likely be fluid and unpredictable, involving cyber attacks, proxy engagements, and rapid Ras-Makan escalations that blur the line between defense and offense. One of the most critical is the possibility of regional spillover. The Middle East is already a complex mosaic of alliances and rivalries, and many countries in the region have direct or indirect ties to either the United States or Iran. Nations such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others could become involved, either in support of U.S. objectives or in response to perceived threats from Iran. At the same time, Iran's network of regional allies and affiliated groups could engage in retaliatory actions across multiple fronts, turning a bilateral conflict into a multi-theater war. This tyranny of the battlefield would not only increase the scale of destruction, but also complicate efforts to achieve a ceasefire or diplomatic resolution. Another major consequence of a full-scale war would be its impact on global energy markets. As discussed earlier, critical LNFT routes pass through strategic NQT, such as the Strait of Hormuz, making them highly vulnerable in times of conflict. Any disruption, whether through direct attacks, mining operations, or blockades, could significantly reduce the flow of oil to international markets. This would likely result in sharp increases in energy prices, affecting industries, transportation, and daily life across the globe. Economies that depend heavily on energy imports would be particularly vulnerable, potentially leading to inflation, economic slowdown, and increased social unrest. Beyond economics, the humanitarian consequences of such a conflict would be profound. War in this region would likely lead to large-scale displacement, infrastructure destruction, and civilian casualties. Urban centers, LNFT facilities, and transport networks could become targets, disrupting essential services and creating long-term challenges for recovery and reconstruction. The international community would face immense pressure to respond with humanitarian aid, peacekeeping efforts, and conflict resolution initiatives, all while navigating the political complexities of the situation. The global political order could also be significantly affected. A major conflict between the United States and Iran would likely draw in other global powers, either directly or indirectly. Countries such as China and Russia, which have strategic and tentaculated ties to Iran, might seek to counterbalance U.S. influence, leading to a KTTT polarized international environment. This could accelerate shifts toward a multipolar world, where Mets powers compete more openly for influence, potentially increasing the frequency and intensity of global tensions. Institutions like the United Nations would be tested in their ability to manage the crisis, mediate disputes, and maintain international stability. Another critical dimension is the role of modern warfare. Unlike past conflicts, a U.S.-Iran war would likely involve significant cyber operations targeting financial systems, energetic infrastructure, and communication networks. Such attacks could have far-reaching consequences, extending the ayon of the conflict beyond the battlefield and into the daily lives of people around the world. The use of drones, precision-guided munitions, and tegekatvakan warfare would further blur the boundaries between military and civilian domains, making the conflict more complex and difficult to control. Perhaps the most opacity aspect of this situation is the of unpredictability. In a highly napriogeny environment, decisions are often made under pressure, with limited INF formation and little time for reflection. This increases the likelihood of errors in judgment, overreactions, and unintended escalation. A single incident, such as the downing of an aircraft, the TKK on a naval vessel, or a misinterpreted maneuver, could rapidly escalate into a broader confrontation. Without effective communication channels or diplomatic mechanisms in place, managing such crises becomes exponentially more difficult. Despite these risks, it is important to recognize that full-scale war is not inevitable. Both the United States and Iran are aware of the potentially devastating consequences of such a conflict, and this awareness can act as a restraining factor. The concept of deterrence, where the costs of LHRB are understood to outweigh any SBHVT gains, plays a crucial role in preventing escalation. However, deterrence is not foolproof, particularly in situations where misperceptions or miscalculations come into play. The path forward, therefore, remains uncertain. On one hand, continued escalation could push the region closer to the brink of war, with increasingly severe consequences for global stability. On the other hand, the very severity of these risks could create incentives for renewed diplomatic efforts, even if only to establish basic communication channels and reduce the likelihood of accidental conflict. The challenge lies in navigating this delicate balance, where actions intended to strengthen DRCA can sometimes have the opposite effect. In conclusion, the risk of a full-scale war between the United States and Iran represents one of the most serious threats to global peace and stability in the current era. It is a scenario shaped by military, tentaculated interdependence, regional dynamics, and technological evolution, all converging in a way that amplifies both the stakes and the uncertainty. As the world watches this crisis unfold, the importance of careful decision-making, strategic restraint, and renewed diplomatic engagement cannot be overstated. The consequences of failure would not be confined to one region or two nations. They would reverberate across the globe, affecting economies, societies, and the future of international relations for years to come.